All right, everyone. Welcome to the quarterly review meeting for the Town of Fairfield Board of Finance. Would everybody please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? Mr. DeWitt, would you lead us in the pledge tonight?
I certainly would. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Would everyone please remain standing since it is, first of all, happy Thanksgiving to everyone. I hope you all have a great holiday with your friends and family. And at this point, I think it'd be appropriate for us to do a moment of silence for everything we're thankful for and for all the town residents we've lost in the past year. Thank you very much. All right. Tonight we have 4 items on our agenda. The first is to review the Abbreviated Board of Education first quarter fiscal year 2017 financial position. Second is to review the Abbreviated Town's first quarter financial position. Third is the current state of the town's pension and OPEB funds. And fourth is to hear any updates from Board of Finance subcommittees. I would be remiss if I buried the lead and did not say that one of the topics for discussion that will come up during the Board of Finance, or rather the town's financial analysis, would be a discussion of the sale of the General Electric former headquarters to Sacred Heart University and what that may look like to the town over the next many years. In speaking with Mr. Mayor, who I reached out with yesterday, as well as Mr. Tetro, there are very few hard facts known at this time, though we do have certain scenarios that Mr. Mayor can walk us through and discuss what the financial impact may be. It's probably appropriate, given that this is the end of our term here, for us to kind of review some of those challenges that will be facing us. We do have budget season coming upon us quite quickly. We know there will be some impact from the General Electric situation in the next budget cycle. That impact would largely be due to maybe a reduction in personal property tax revenue. We believe we're okay from a real estate tax revenue standpoint for at least the next fiscal year. There's also the ongoing situation with the state, where we've seen a reduction in their funding to us in the last budget cycle, and probably going to be more as we move forward based on what's going on at the state level. For my colleagues, if you follow the news, the state's fiscal situation does seem to be more precarious even than originally thought. That being the case, we're likely to have those challenges facing us through the next budget cycle and ongoing, and we need to be cognizant of that. I know the First Selectman is, I know the CFO is, because I've spoken to both of them repeatedly over the last few days about that. Any questions, comments, or concerns before we dive in to our financial review? Seeing none, we're going to head right over to the Board of Education and go through their first quarter financial position. Dr. Tracy's here along with Mrs. Manzel. Thank you for coming, and Mr. Dwyer's here as well to represent the board. Mr. Dwyer, congratulations on your re-election as the board chairman for another term. Dr. Tracy, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your All right, everyone.
service to the town in the interim
Welcome
capacity.
to the quarterly review meeting.
This is probably the last meeting
for
we'll
the
see you
Town
at.
of Fairfield Board of
And we
Finance.
wish
Unless you have a
Everybody, please
Thanksgiving
rise
meeting
for the
planned,
Pledge of
that'll be it. But
Mr.
thank you
DeWitt,
for your
would
kind
you lead
words.
us in the pledge tonight?
All right. Why don't we just get right through it and go right to your numbers?
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
Well,
under God,
there's not much to say about
liberty and
the
justice
report with
Would everyone
only 3
please remain
months
standing,
of,
since it is,
of
first of all, happy
activity.
Thanksgiving to everyone.
However,
I hope you all
it does
have a
happen
great
to
holiday with
capture
your friends and
the beginning
family.
of school.
And at this point, I think it'd be
and
appropriate for us
that's
to do a
when,
moment of silence for everything we're
our
thankful
actual,
for and for all the town
staffing
residents
is
we've
determined
lost
based
in
on the
past
actual
year.
enrollment. We did add 10.7 certified staff 7 of them were elementary positions.
Thank you very much.
All right.
8 of them were elementary
Tonight, we
positions.
have 4 items
7 you might
on our
remember were
agenda.
budgeted,
The
in
first is to review the
Board of Ed
abbreviated
request
Board of
this year.
Education first quarter fiscal
because we
year
felt that
2017
there
financial
were,
position. Second is to review the
several,
abbreviated Towns first quarter
classes that were, had the
financial
potential
position.
to increase
Third
because they
is the
were
current
either
state of
1
the
or
town's
2
pension and
students
OPEB
below the
funds.
threshold.
And fourth
And then
is
there
to
was
hear any
one that was
updates
above
from
that
Board
had
of
the potential
Finance
to collapse.
subcommittees.
So,
I would be
of the
remiss
7
if
that
I
we had
buried the
requested that was
lead
ultimately
and
cut
did
by the
not
Board
say
of
that one of the topics
Selectmen,
for discussion
6
that
of
will
them
come up
that
during
we
the
ended
Board
up
of
adding
Finance, or
were
rather the Towns
anticipated.
financial analysis,
The remaining
would be a discussion of the
2.7
sale of
staff
the General Electric
were net
former
adjustments
headquarters
across the
to
district.
Sacred Heart University.
We did have 28
and what that
retirees.
may look
We
like
had
to the
budgeted
town over the
18.
next many
We also
years.
added
In
7.3
speaking with Mr.
non-certified
Mayor, who I
staff.
reached out with yesterday,
They were all,
well as Mr.
they were all
Tetreault,
special ed staff.
there are very
and all
few
the
hard
result
facts
of
known at this
the
time.
needs of independent,
Though we do have certain
individual
scenarios that Mr.
education
Mayor can
plans
walk
for our
us
special
through
ed students.
and discuss
So
what the
please remind us,
financial
I'm sorry,
impact
one more
may be.
time, the budget called for
Probably
how many
appropriate,
new FTEs?
given that this is the
The
end of
elementary,
our
7.
term here.
Okay, and how many did we
For us to
end
kind
up
of
in
review some
elementary?
of those challenges that will be
Okay, and
facing us.
how about
We do have
at the middle
budget
school
season
level?
coming upon us quite quickly.
I don't have a breakdown of that.
We know there will
that
be some
it was
impact from the
2.7
General Electric
across
situation
the district
in
for,
the
and those were
next
you
budget
know,
cycle.
pluses
That
and
impact would
minuses here and
largely
there.
be due to
So overall,
maybe a
did
reduction in
we
personal
added
property tax
2.7 more
We believe
personnel
we're okay from a
than we thought we were
real
gonna
estate
add?
tax revenue
in addition to the
standpoint
8
for at least the next
elementary.
fiscal year.
Okay, so I guess,
When we look,
10.7.
there's also
no,
the
let's
ongoing
just talk about the
situation
school
with the
district
state,
as a whole, I'm sorry.
Okay.
where we've seen a reduction
School district as
in
a
their
whole, how many
funding
new
to
staff
us
were you budgeted to
in the
add
last budget
for the school
cycle,
district as a whole?
and
in this budget
probably
year?
going to
Were
be
we
more as we
budgeted to
move
add?
forward
Yeah.
based on what's going on at the state level.
I think there was a decrease
For my
in
colleagues, if
certified
you
until
followed the
Okay,
news,
but we
the
ended up with an
state's
increase?
fiscal
We ended up with an
situation
increase.
does seem to
So
be
what's that delta in
more
terms of how
precarious
many
even than
staff?
originally thought. That being the
10.7
case, we're
certified.
likely to have
No, but if we were to add
those
it,
challenges
I'm sorry, I'm trying to
facing
get the
us,
delta between the budget
through
and
the
what
next
you
budget
actually ended
cycle
up adding.
and ongoing.
Because you just said, hey,
And
I
we
think
need
the
to be
budget,
cognizant of
and
that.
that's what I
I know
recall.
the first selectman
The budget
is,
was
I
flat
know
to
the
down.
CFO is.
Right, and you just said we
because
ended up
I've
adding
spoken to
staff.
both of them
Correct.
repeatedly over the
Okay.
over the
So
last few
budget
days
to
about
actual,
that.
we're up 10.7
Any
certified
questions,
and
comments,
7.3
or concerns
non-certified.
before we dive in
10.7 certified
to
and
our
7
financial
point,
review? Seeing none,
3.
we're going to head right over to the Board of
So
Education.
that's as compared to
and
budget,
go through their
not as
first
compared to
quarter
prior year.
financial
Correct.
position. Dr. Tracy's here
So
along
you're
with
up.
Mrs. Manzel.
That's where I was
Thank
going
you for
wrong.
coming, and
So
Mr.
you're up
Dwyer's here as well to
18
represent the board.
positions
Mr. Dwyer,
from what you
congratulations
thought the
on your
budget
reelection as the
was.
board chairman for another term.
As Ms. Mansell
Dr.
mentioned,
Tracy,
were
thank you very much for being here.
increases in
Thank you for
student
your
enrollment, taking us beyond the
service
class
to the
size
town in the interim
threshold
capacity.
and
I know this
requirements
is
of
probably the last
individualized
meeting we'll see you
education
at.
plans per the
We wish
Unless you
you
have
well.
a Thanksgiving
Okay, so
meeting
this-
planned.
how
then
many
that'd be
were-
it, but thank you
and
for
is
your
that
kind
7
words.
that were due to the
All right.
special ed law?
Why don't you
And
guys,
the other
why don't we just
11
get
were
right through it
due to
and go
class
right to your
size or
numbers?
what?
Well, 7.3, there's not much to say about all special ed. The
7.3
report
were all
was,
special ed.
Only 3 months
And then
of
10.7 were all,
activity. However, the
Class size.
8 were the
It does happen
elementary
to
and
capture
the beginning of
2.7
school.
net
Difference, I don't think
and
any of them were
that's
special
when,
ed.
okay. So
our
that would have been
actual,
class size then?
Staffing
Okay.
is determined based on the actual enrollment. We did add 10.7 certified staff.
Thank you. I'm sorry, guys.
7 of them
My
were
apologies
elementary
for waylaying
positions.
that conversation. I was trying to figure that out in this write-up.
8 of them.
another
were
thing-
Just Marmy, and
elementary
I think it's a
positions.
follow-up.
7, you might remember, were budgeted
Let me get a little
in
closer
the,
here.
original
So,
Board of Ed
and I think it's a
request
good discussion
this
because
year.
I was a little confused. So you had
because we
initially
felt that
requested,
There were
I believe, was
several,
it 7 or 8?
classes that were,
And that
had the
was cut
potential
at the
to
Board of
increase
Selectmen
because they
level.
were
Is that
either 1 or
correct?
2
So
students
originally
below
you
the
had
threshold.
requested,
And then there was one that was
7 or
above
8, I'm
that
sorry.
had the potential to
7.
collapse. So
you were anticipating the need
of
for
the 7
7.
that we had
but
requested,
that was cut from the
ultimately
budget.
cut by the Board
So
of
then
Selectmen.
here we are,
6
and
of
you
them
actually needed to
that we ended
hire.
up adding were anticipated.
8.
The remaining.
Exactly. So you were kind of right on the
2.7
money
staff
when you were
were
projecting.
net adjustments across the
Initially.
district.
Except you're
We
still
did
off
have
10.
28 retirees. We had
Right.
budgeted 18.
I mean,
We
the
also
math.
added
You said we were at 0.
7.3 non-certified staff.
the budget at 0.
They were all.
You said you
they
needed
were- They
7.
were all special ed staff.
Right. Got cut
and all
back
the
to 0.
result of
So you
the needs
were,
of individual
ended up hiring
education
18.
plans for our special ed students.
So you were actually off
So
by 11.
please remind us, I'm sorry, one more time, the budget called
Right.
for how many new FTEs?
Non-certified, right.
Whatever, I'm just
The
doing the
elementary,
total. I'm just
7.
doing the total. At this point,
Okay, and how
I'm
many
staying
did we
macro.
end up
But
in
I don't,
elementary?
there was no way to anticipate the special
Okay,
ed
and how about
increases.
at the middle school level?
I don't have a breakdown of
Okay.
that.
Okay,
It was 2.7
item of
across
note
in the financials is
the
district
for-
this is the
and
first
those
year
were,
of the Connecticut Partnership
pluses
Plan.
and minuses
So
here
we're
and there.
now on
So overall, did
premium-based
we
expenses rather
added
than the
2.7 more personnel?
claims, and
than we thought
July
we
and
were gonna
August
add?
are reflected in
In
this
addition to
financial
the 8
report.
elementary.
Okay, so I guess, when we look at,
10.7, as
no,
always, the
let's just
special
talk
ed,
about the
or
school district as a
pupil
whole. I'm sorry,
personnel
I'm
shows a
confusing.
negative number.
School
but
district as a
there's,
whole, how many
offsets that
new
will be coming
staff
with
were
the
you budgeted
excess
to
cost
add for the
reimbursement.
school district as a whole in this budget
And
year?
those
we
are the,
budgeted to add?
maintenance,
Yeah.
can't really speak about maintenance right
I
now.
think there was a decrease
Too
in
many
certified. I'll have to look
variables.
it up.
Okay, but we ended up with an
And we
increase?
do
We ended up with an increase.
defer as many
So
maintenance
how
projects
what's that
and
delta in
capital
terms of
purchases
how
as
many
we can
staff?
until later in the year. Those that make
10.7
sense.
certified.
No, but if we were
until
to
we have
add
a
it,
better handle on
I'm sorry, I'm
those
trying to get the
expenses.
delta between the budget and what you actually ended up adding.
What's concerning
Because
you right
just
now
said, hey, I
besides
think the
the
budget,
personnel issues?
and
Where
that's
are
what
we
I
over?
recall.
What's
The budget was flat to
What's
down,
concerning you right
right?
now?
And you
this
just said
budget?
we ended up
So you're
adding
over in
staff.
personnel
Right.
costs.
Okay.
So you're
budget to
managing that,
actual,
you
we're
found the
up
reductions to
10.7
manage that,
certified.
right?
And 7.3
working on it.
non-certified.
Okay, so what other areas of concern
10.7
are they
certified
as we
and
sit here?
7
That's it right
point,
now.
That's it.
3.
So that's as compared
Any
to
other
budget, not as compared to
questions?
prior year.
Correct.
Right. So you're up,
From anyone.
that's where I was going wrong.
and
So
you
you're
have
up
no
18
information
positions.
There was
some discussion, I know
from
we're
what
going to
you
get into
thought
this a
the
little bit
budget
on the town side
was.
regarding additional reductions from the state budget after
As
all the
Mansell
budgets
mentioned,
were
were
approved.
Right.
increases
don't
in
have
student
any
enrollment,
information.
taking
No
us
additional
beyond the
information.
class size threshold, and requirements
Mr.
of
Mayor, do you have
individualized
any additional
education
information?
plans per the special ed law.
Okay, so this, how many
ECS
were,
on this?
and is that 7 that were due to the special ed law? And the other 11 were
Please
due
put the mic
to
on.
class size, or
Thanks.
what?
Yeah, the original budget, if you remember, was like
7.3,
3.8 million, something like that.
We're
and
all special ed.
State cut 2 million.
7.3 were all special ed.
And we were
And then
anticipating losing some of that.
10.7 were all,
That payment comes in 3
8
increments.
were the elementary, and
We get,
the 2.7
October,
net difference, I don't think any of
January,
them were
and then
special
the
ed.
end of the year.
okay.
And it's
So that would have been
generally
class size then?
25%, 25%, 50%. We received the first payment, and it was right at the 25% of the 1/6 that
Thank you, I'm sorry,
that was
guys,
in the budget.
my
We also
apologies
got a
for
communication
waylaying
from
that
the state
conversation, I was
that
trying to figure that
kind
out.
of
in this
implied,
round.
not absolutely stated. that we should
another
just
thing-
do the
Marmion,
whole
I think
thing,
is a
but,
follow-up.
Obviously, on watch.
Let me get a little closer here. So, and I
Are there any
think it's
other
a good
questions
discussion
from board
because I
members?
was a little confused. So you had initially requested,
Let's go back, I want to make sure I
I
understand the personnel
believe,
thing.
was it
So,
7 or 8?
10
And that was
of
cut
the
at the Board of
positions
Selectmen level, is
were
that
related
correct?
to class size.
So originally you
7
had
of the
requested
positions were related to
7 or 8, I'm sorry.
additional
7.
incremental special.
You were anticipating the need for 7,
that
but that
were
was
unknown
cut
when the
from the
budget was
budget.
put together.
So then, here we are, and you actually needed to hire
Thank you. Anybody else? Mrs. Leclerc?
8
8.
elementary.
Exactly. So you were kind of right on the money when you were projecting
None of the projected classes.
initially.
Except you're still
Thank you.
off
collapsed,
10.
meaning that we needed every class
Right.
that was originally
I mean,
projected.
do the math.
I
You
guess,
said
and
we were at 0.
So we didn't go
Right.
down from.
The budget at 0.
4 classes
You said
to
you
3
needed 7.
classes in any
Right.
place to
Got
to
cut back to
save,
0.
the
So you
number
were-
of teachers.
You
Is
ended up
that-
hiring 18, so you were actually off by 11.
Right, they added, but usually it
Right.
goes both ways. Sometimes you need less
Non-certified,
classes.
right.
Whatever, I'm just doing the total. I'm just
We
doing the
had,
total. At this point, I'm staying macro.
But I don't, there was no way to
The 6
anticipate
that we
the special ed
anticipated
increases.
in the budget,
plus there were 4 adds and 2 reductions.
Okay.
Okay,
That makes up the
another item of note in the
difference of
financials
the,
is that,
you know,
this is the first year of
eight
the
were based on the
Connecticut
6 that we
Partnership Plan.
outlined
So
in the
we're now
budget.
on premium-based expenses
different-
rather
the
than
other
the,
two
were
a
claims,
reduction of 4,
and
July
reduction
and
of 2,
August
and
are
an addition
reflected
of
in this
4.
financial report.
Okay. So it did go in some
As
cases
always,
down.
There
the
were some
special
down,
ed,
right.
the pupil personnel shows a negative number, but there's offsets
In
that
the
will be
same
coming
way,
with the
how many
excess cost reimbursement.
Grades in which schools are within 1 or 2.
Those are the,
of going
maintenance,
up,
can't really speak
and
about
how many are
maintenance, right?
close to going
You know,
down,
too many
who
variables.
moves in and out of town over the next few months.
And we do
Now, I had
defer as many
watched the
maintenance
Board of Ed
projects
meeting on
and
Fair
capital
TV,
purchases as we
and there was a
can
discussion
until
at
later in the
their
year.
meeting that
Those
there
that make
were
sense,
more open choice students
until we have
taken
a
this
better
year
handle
than
on
had been in
these
the budget.
expenses.
So did any of them create any
What's
of those
concerning you right now
classes?
besides the
No,
personnel
I
issues?
checked with all
Where
the
are we
elementary
over?
principals on that
What's-
score, and we make a
What's
point of
concerning
placing
you
those
right
youngsters
now
in
this budget?
classes that
So you're
will not
over
trigger
in
an
personnel
overage.
costs.
One of
So
the
you're
points that
managing
I
that.
did
You
make to the
found the
board, however,
reductions
is
to
that
manage
one
that,
cannot
right?
predict 4 or 5 years
We're
down the
working on it.
road
Okay, so what other areas
whether or
of
not the
concern are
presence
they
of
as
those
we sit here?
youngsters
That's it right now.
might push us over
That's
the
it.
bubble one way or the other. It's just, there's just too many things that can happen.
Any other
But when
questions?
when we initially admit these youngsters, typically to kindergarten and
anyone?
first grade classes, we put
And
them in
you have
situations
no
where they will not
information. There
bring
was
us
some
close to the
discussion, I
edge.
know we're going to get
Okay,
into
but
this a
did
little
they
bit on
keep
the
us
town side
from
regarding
collapsing a
additional
class?
reductions from the state
There are
budget.
3 cases that I know of this
After all
year,
the budgets were approved.
Right.
as
we
these
don't have
youngsters have
any
moved into
information.
higher
No
grades,
additional information.
where had nothing else changed, and if you
Mr.
back the
Mayor, do
open
you have
choice
any
children
additional
out,
information?
we would have been able to reduce a class,
ECS
say, going from 4 to 3. Increasing the class size, of course, for the youngsters remaining, but
Please put the
saving a
mic on.
teaching job, a
Thanks.
teaching slot,
Yeah,
if you will.
the original budget,
just
if you remember,
looking
was
at
like
today,
3.8 million, something like that. and
as I say, we
State
identified
cut 2
3
million,
such
so the new
classes.
budget was 1.6, and
forward,
we're
and as we
anticipating losing some of
place
that.
kids this year
That
and next
payment
year,
comes in 3
we avoid
increments.
situations where we're
We
close to the
get
bubble.
October,
Can I have a follow-up to
January,
this
and then
little
the
first
end of
question?
the year.
The way you
It's
phrased it just confused me.
Generally
I just wanna
25%,
make sure.
25%,
So,
50%. We
the open
received the
choice
first
kids
payment, and it was right
that
at the
were in
25%
this
of
year's
the
budget,
1.6.
not next year. I know there was a
that was in
discussion
the
about the
budget.
next couple of years.
We also
right?
got a communique
In
from the
this year.
state that kind of
Mr. Leclerc
implied,
just said,
not
are there
really
more
stated that we
kids,
should be getting
open
the full
choice
thing,
kids
but
in the school district this year
we're
than what
obviously
was originally allowed in the
watch.
budget? Allowed for in the budget? Are there any other questions
I'm not
from
sure,
board members?
I'd have to check the budget to see what the budget says. I can tell you
Let's go
that
back.
last year,
I want to make sure I
15,
understand the
16, there
personnel
were
thing.
60 open
So,
choice youngsters in town.
10
This year,
of the
there are
positions
72.
were related
So
to
we went up by
class
12
size. year on year.
We
and
did go
7
up
of
by
the
12
positions
From
were
last year
related
to this year.
additional
Was that allowed
incremental
for in the budget?
special ed needs
Correct.
that were unknown.
So
when
why
the
did
budget
we
was
allow
put together?
72 and
Correct.
If it was based on 60? Okay.
I actually don't know. When I
Anybody
got
else?
here and began
Mrs. Leclerc.
checking on enrollments and class sizes,
On
that's
page
when I
2, it says
was
that,
told by our folks at
none of the
CES who
projected
run the open choice
classes,
program that they actually had
collapsed,
72
meaning that
youngsters
we
on our
needed every
roster. And
class
I was
that
then
was
able to confirm
originally
that they all had seats.
projected,
and,
I guess, and
that none of
so
those
we
seats
didn't go
triggered
down
an additional
from having
class
4
section.
classes to
But the
3
number
classes.
is
and
higher this
any
year than it
place
was
to-
last year.
To save,
And I don't know in the budget whether
the
we would
number of
have,
teachers.
other than the revenue that we get for
Well, is that-
each of these children, how else they would have been in the budget.
right, they
we get-
added,
we
but
get
the-
$3,000
but some- usually it
per
goes both
student.
ways. Sometimes
Yeah,
you
but
need less
I-
classes than
Is-
projected.
Who makes the decision
We
if there were
had,
60 allowed for? Who makes the decision that we're
The
going to go to
6 that we
72?
anticipated in the
I'd
budget.
have to check. I assume those were decisions made
Plus
by
there
the
were
central
4
office
adds
prior to
and
my
2
getting here.
reductions.
I
That
think
makes
I
up
can
the
Mr.
check
Dwyer's
and
coming
find
up, yeah.
the
Excuse me?
difference of the.
Mr. Dwyer's
you know,
coming up behind you.
The 8
Hopefully
were
he's not
based
gonna
on the
hit you in the
6
back
that
of the
we
head. I'm not sure.
outlined in the budget.
Welcome,
And
Mr.
then
Dwyer.
the other 2 were
Thank you.
a reduction of 4,
By
a reduction of
policy,
2
the
and an
Fairfield
addition
school
of
system
4.
has been engaged in the open
Okay.
choice.
So
Yeah,
it
no, I
did
know
go,
that.
Program for
in
years.
some cases, down.
There were some
Over
down,
the
right.
last 5 years,
We track that. We're
maybe 6 years ago, we were up
Next
to
year's
as
budget
high
in
as
the same way.
79,
How
Yeah.
many
came down to 60.
grades in
And I
which
think if
schools
you
are
look
within
at
1
the
or 2
enrollment of the open
of
choice
going up,
students,
and
that
how
as
many are
our
close
enrollment
to
was
going
growing,
down? town, depending
slots
who
available
moves in and out
were
of town over the
shrinking,
next few months.
and as our
Now,
enrollment
I
is
had
shrinking,
watched the Board
the
of Ed
available
meeting
slots
on
will
Fair
open up.
TV,
But
and
who
there was
makes
a
the choice?
discussion at their meeting that there were more
answer that
open
question.
choice
Uh,
students
it is
taken
the
this year than had
administration that
been in the
decides
budget.
what
So did
slots
any
are
of them
available and where to
create
place them
any
and
of
how
these
many.
extra classes?
It is not board policy.
No, I checked with
Board
all the
policy
elementary
is to
principals on that score,
participate in
and
the
we make a
program,
point of placing those
and
youngsters in
practice has
classes
been
that will
to,
not
bring
trigger an
students in
overage.
where we know that
One of the points
at least
that
for
I
the
did
first
make to the
2
board,
years or
however,
3
is that
years,
one cannot
they will not
predict 4 or
create
5
another
years
section.
down the road
You can't guarantee what happens
whether or
with
not
the
the presence of
in-migration
those youngsters
students over time
might push
as
us
they
over
move
the
into
bubble one
homes
way or
and
the
they're in
other.
the
It's
right
just,
grade.
there's just too many
What
things
will
that can
happen in
happen.
the
But when
third,
we,
fourth, or fifth year.
when we initially admit these youngsters, typically
Okay, so
to
it wasn't a
kindergarten
board-
and first grade
I'm
classes,
just trying to figure out,
we
I'm
put them
following
in
up on Mrs.
situations
Leclerc's. It
where they
wasn't a
will
board
not
vote.
bring
There
us
wasn't
close to the
anything that
edge.
said we're going to go
Okay,
from
but
60
did
to
they keep us
72. It was
from
administration
collection of
decision.
class?
Correct. And
There are
typically,
3 cases that I know of
for
this year,
outside sources of revenue.
as these youngsters have moved into higher grades,
Typically, I think.
where
we
had
have
nothing
been
else changed, and
conservative
if you
in
back the
budgeting
open
any
choice children
expected
out,
increase
we would
in
have been able
students
to
because we
reduce a
make that
class,
Decision in
say,
December,
going
for
from
instance,
4 to 3.
of,
Increasing the
15,
class size, of course,
what
for
to
the
start
youngsters
developing a
remaining,
budget
but
on,
saving a
and
teaching job,
give it to,
a teaching slot, if
the
you will.
town bodies, and then
So
from May
just
they
looking at
vote.
today,
Typically, we kind of say, well, let's
as
just
I say,
assume
we
the same
identified
as
3
prior
such
year,
classes.
even before we
Going
know what
forward,
the
and as we
enrollment projections.
place kids this year and next year,
Thank you.
we avoid
Thanks for the
situations where we're
clarification.
close to the
Anybody else?
bubble.
Thank you, Mr. Leclerc, for the question. Go ahead, Mr. Brown. Can I have a follow-up to Mr. Leclerc's
what is
question?
our
The way you
student
phrased it just
population
confused
this
me.
year?
I just want to make sure. So
Just a shade under
the open
10,000.
choice kids that were in this year's budget,
9,900.
not next year. I know there was a discussion about the next
Very-
couple of
Very
years.
close to 10,000.
In this
Down
year.
slightly from last year, maybe by.
Mr. Leclerc just said, are there more
Overall.
kids,
We are
open
up at
choice
the
kids in the
elementary-
school district
excuse
this
me,
year
we're up at the middle
than
school
what
level
was
next
originally
year.
allowed in the budget?
A large fifth grade
Allowed
will
for
move
in the
up,
budget?
but the Yeah, I'm enrollment not today sure, is just a shade
I'd have to
under
check the
10,000.
budget to see what the budget says. I can tell you that last year,
Just slightly down
15,
from
16, there
from
were
last
60
year.
open choice youngsters in
But
town.
quite a bit from
This
a
year,
couple years
there are
ago.
72.
We were what?
So we went up by 12 year on year.
We
The
did go up
highest
by
we got
12
was about 10,000.
last year to this year.
25,
This is-
somewhere around
was
there.
that allowed
So
for in
over
the budget?
last 4 years, we've lost probably.
So why did we allow 72 and
In
if it was
various
based
grades.
on 60?
I actually don't know. When I got here and began checking on enrollments and class sizes, that's when I was told by our folks at CES who run the open choice program that they actually had 72 youngsters on our
All right.
roster.
Let's go
And
to the
I was then
town-
able to
actually,
confirm that they
let me
all
take
had
these out of
seats
orders, if
and
it's okay with everybody,
that
'cause
none
we've
of
been
those
concerned
seats
that town
triggered
has to
an
stay
additional
Thank you. Have a good
class
night.
section.
And Dr.
But the
Tracy,
number
best
is
of luck to you.
higher
Thank
this
you.
year than it was last year.
I'm going to ask
And
that
I don't
we
know in
review
the
current state
budget
of the
whether we
town's
would
pension
have,
and OPEB
other than the
funds, which is
revenue
out
that
of
we
numbers.
get
Does anybody
for
have a problem with that?
each of these children, how else they would have been in
Come
the
on up,
budget.
Mr. Behe. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, we get $3,000 per student.
Yeah, but who makes the decision if there were 60 allowed for? Who makes the decision that we're going to go to 72?
I'd have to check. I assume those were decisions made by the central
Welcome and
office
happy
prior to my
Thanksgiving.
getting here.
I see
And I can
Mr.
certainly check
Dwyer's
and
coming
find
up.
out.
Yeah.
Excuse me?
All right.
Mr. Dwyer's coming up behind you. Hopefully, he's not going to hit you on the back of the head. I'm not sure, but
Is there any
Welcome,
material
Mr. Dwyer.
difference from what we talked about
Thank
several
you.
weeks back?
By policy, the Fairfield school system has been engaged in the open choice
Yeah,
student
no, I know
enrollment
that.
program for years.
yeah.
Over the last 5 years,
I believe we spoke
maybe
about
6
the,
years ago, we
one
were
hedge
up
fund
to as high as
investment
79.
Yeah.
that was
Came
winding
down to
had
60,
closed,
and I
we were
think if
looking
you
at how to
look
deploy
at
that
the
and
enrollment
decided
of
to
the
go into
open
something
choice
called a
students,
multi-asset class,
that as our
fund,
enrollment
which
was growing,
similar,
slots available
outcomes
were
to a hedge
shrinking,
fund, but,
and as our
more
enrollment is
liquid
shrinking,
and,
the available slots will open
lower
up.
cost.
But
it
who
is
makes the
admin-
choice?
That manager, but that's
I was about to answer that
going
question.
Sorry.
It
narrow
is
the
the
field
administration
at
that
our
decides
upcoming meeting
what slots are
on the
available and where to
5th
place them and how many.
of next month.
It is not board policy. Board policy is to
So that's why you
participate
see
in the
cash is a little
program,
high, 'cause the
and
money's not
the practice
being
has
put into
been
anything else.
to
Right,
bring
everything
students
else is
in where we know that
well within
at
kind
least
of our
for the
targets,
first 2
right?
years or 3 years,
Yes.
they will not create another section.
And
You
there's
can't
not much. There's
guarantee what
only a
happens
couple of investments that are
in-migration
over
of students over time.
that 10%
As they move into
marker,
homes and
correct?
they're in the right grade. What
Black
will
Rock
happen
being the
in
largest one.
third, fourth, or fifth year.
Okay.
Individually.
Okay, so it wasn't a
Yeah.
board,
Yes, you
I'm
just
just trying to
see,
figure out,
there
I'm
should be
following
that
up on
one
Mrs.
in the
Leclerc, there wasn't a
fixed
board
income
vote.
side,
There wasn't anything
Yeah,
that said
there's a
we're going to go
couple.
from 60 to
Montgomery,
72. It
Wells
was
Fargo,
administration
Montgomery.
decision.
Correct. And typically,
anybody have any questions
for
on the
outside
investment classes
sources of revenue,
or the mix
in this
of
case, the
managers before we
3,000,
move on?
typically, I think
All right, let's
we
go to
have
return
been
real quick, which is the
conservative
last
in
page.
budgeting any expected
On this one?
increase of students, because we make that decision in
We're
December,
at
for
fiscal
instance,
year-to-date 2.9
of
versus target of
15,
3.15.
what to start developing the
Some of the
budget on, and
underperformance
then we
is due to,
give it to, the
cash drag
town
we've had
bodies,
for
and
past
then
couple of
come
months.
May, they vote. So typically,
and
we
I
kind of
think
say,
our,
well, let's just assume the same as the prior
equity,
year, even before we know what the enrollment
funds have been
projections are.
lagging somewhat in
Thank you.
comparison to their indices.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the clarification.
Nothing,
Anybody else? Thank you, Ms. Leclerc, for the
seriously
question.
out of
Mr. Brown.
bounds, so,
What
you
is
see our
our
12-month
student population
returns
this
and
year?
our
Do you have a
36-month
count yet?
returns.
It's just a shade under 10,000,
Questions on returns?
9,900.
Seeing none quickly,
something.
how's
It's
the
very-
study going?
very close
I know
to
you're doing one on
10,000,
the
down
pension, I
slightly
believe
from
you're doing
last
one
year,
on the
maybe
OPEB.
by
Where do you guys
8 or
stand
10
on that
students
right now?
overall. We are up at the elementary, excuse me, we're up at the middle school level next year because of a large
Sorry, I
fifth
didn't-
grade that
can you
will
say
move
that
up.
in the mic? I didn't-
But the
Sorry,
enrollment today is just a shade under
They'll be at our
10,000.
upcoming meeting.
Okay.
Okay, so you're going to report out on that in
And just
January
slightly
on
down
what
from
any change in
from
assumptions
last
are going to
year.
be?
But quite a bit
that's when I'm
from a
supposed to
couple
come
years
next.
ago, right? We were what,
And
10,000?
they're going to,
Or was that
The
just a
highest we got
projection?
was
with
about
budget- budgeting purposes,
10,325,
whatever
somewhere around
revised
there. So over the last
calculation of required
4 years,
contribution is
we've
based on
lost
new
probably
assumptions.
400.
Yeah, we already have.
In various grades.
Sensitivity to numbers.
Anybody else?
I know
And
that, I'm
I'd
not
be
quite
happy to
certain,
forward our.
I know we have reports coming in
breakdown for
December.
your information.
That'd be
I
great.
I was thinking we might not
Thank
be
you so
voting
much
till
for that.
January.
We
but,
appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you. Thank you,
We'll
Mr.
see.
Dwyer.
Yeah.
Based on what
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
All right,
Not
let's
certain.
go to
So
the
where are
town,
we coming out
actually, I'm
and what's-
going to take
so-
these out of
so they
order. if it's
basically
okay with
advised
everybody,
you
'cause
about
Mr.
what's
Beatty's
going
here
on,
and
what
the town
their
side has to stay anyway.
guidance is,
Thank
but
you, have a good night.
haven't made any
And
votes
Dr.
or
Tracy,
decisions
best of
yet.
luck
Is
to you,
that
and thank
fair
you.
to say?
We received
I'm going to
guidance
ask that we
from
review the current state of the town's
investment
pension and
manager.
OPEB funds, which is
They
item number
don't
3. Does
go
anybody have a
on-
problem with
They
that?
look at the numbers
Bringing that
over a
up?
5 to
Great.
10-year period.
Come on up, Mr. Vahey.
The
Thank you for being
actuaries
here.
look at the numbers over a 20 to 40-year period. We haven't heard from the actuaries yet.
But you've heard from the investment advisors.
Right.
What is the Reader's Digest version of how that's heading, not to be
Seems
held
like you
to,
were
but
just
just so
here.
that we're in the loop?
Yeah, I think they think, compared to from about 6.5.
Welcome and happy Thanksgiving.
Correct.
That would be the discount raised, the rate of return.
Thank you.
So
All
they're-
right,
They're
so let's
basically
go,
on that 10-year
let's go
marker or
first of all
whatever
to the
they're saying,
pension side.
6.5. We're currently at 7.5.
Correct.
is there any material difference
So that
from
would
what
be
we
a-
talked
a
about?
point diminution in
several
the
weeks
wrong
back?
direction. Are there things in the other assumptions going in the opposite direction?
No.
Well, that's what we'll hear about
Still
on,
about 350 million
in our
across the
December
same
meeting.
set of asset
Okay,
classes.
so you haven't heard about the other assumptions yet.
Yeah, I wouldn't anticipate. I
major
believe we
changes
spoke
there,
about
though. I mean,
the one hedge fund
You've revised them
investment
as
that
late as last year, I think. on
was
a couple
winding
of them.
down, had closed,
but the
and that
last
we were
time we
looking
did
at
it was- they
how
were
to
all made
deploy
pretty
that, and it was
conservatively,
decided to
so,
go into something called a multi-asset class
I don't see us going
fund,
back
which
to anything
achieves similar
aggressively. There might be some
outcomes to a
changes
hedge
in
fund,
the
but
future rate of
a little more
retirement,
liquid
as
and
far as at target date or beyond, but that's
lower
not- it's not gonna
cost.
change the
So
year
we
numbers
haven't selected that
materially, so
manager, but
The
that's
discount rate will probably
going
be
to
the driver, and
we're going to narrow the
We're not gonna
field
do that
at
all in
our
one
upcoming
time
meeting on the
phased in probably
5th
over the next 5 years.
of next month.
Okay.
But to do that, a point down would be what?
So that's
about
why you see cash is a little high, because
$1 million hit.
money's not being put into anything else.
$350 million
Right, everything else is
Annual three.
well within kind of our targets, right?
Yes.
Something, that's a rough number.
And there's not much, there's only a couple of investments that are over that 10% marker, correct?
Smoothing,
BlackRock being the largest one.
I can't even estimate what that's going to
Individually,
I don't
Yeah.
think
yes, you just see, there should be that one in
it's not
the
gonna be
the
one of
fixed
those
income
things that's
side.
probably gonna actually be the
Yeah, there's a couple.
fund.
Montgomery,
relation to
Wells
the
Fargo,
target more than
Montgomery.
Yeah.
target's gonna be.
Does anybody have any questions on the
So
investment
last year's
classes
sort of flat
or the
return,
mix of
as that
managers
gets
before we
blended
move
over the
on?
next 5 years, that's
All right, let's go to return real quick, which is the last page on this one.
what do they call it anymore? It's not called the.
Yep, we're at fiscal year-to-date 2.9 versus target of 3.15.
Basically, what we can
some of the
expect is in the next budget
underperformance is
cycle,
due
due to
to,
all this, we're going to have some upward
the cash
pressure on
drag that we've had
contributions
for
and pension.
the past couple of months.
Right, yeah, the 3 million might be a
and I
useful
think
number
our,
if you did it all at once or something.
equity
That's what I'm trying to get to, that's over.
funds have been lagging somewhat in comparison to their indices, but
All right,
nothing
so that's an upward
seriously out of
pressure on
bounds, so
Okay.
you can see our 12-month returns
wanna
and our
turn to
36-month
OPEB?
returns.
Yep.
That'd be great.
Great.
Questions on returns?
Any material changes from last
Seeing none,
quarter on
quickly,
this?
how's the study going? I know you're doing one on the pension, I believe you're doing one on the OPEB. Where do you guys stand on that right now?
That's December,
And
they're coming at this upcoming meeting. Slightly above the benchmark.
Sorry, I
It's
didn't,
much-
can you say that in the mic? I didn't.
Sorry, strategy, so they'll be at our upcoming meeting.
Okay, so you're going to report out on that in January on what
Questions,
any change in
comments,
assumptions
concerns
are
from
going to be?
anybody on OPEB at this
Yep,
point in time?
that's when I'm supposed to
This is
come next.
undergoing a similar study at this point as well?
And they're going to,
Yeah.
they're
Same
going to
thing
provide
with
you
the
with
discount rate on
budgeting,
this,
for
or is
budgeting
the discount
purposes
rate-
with whatever the
You're
revised
saying 6.5 on it?
calculation of required contribution is based on new assumptions?
Yeah, we already have, sensitivity to numbers. I know that, I'm not quite certain, I know we have reports coming in December. I was thinking we might not be voting till January,
Follow up on
maybe,
that
though.
and see?
We'll see,
Yeah.
based on what we...
Yeah, so I'm not certain.
So where are we coming out? I mean, so they basically advised you about what's going on, what their guidance is, but you guys haven't made any votes or decisions yet, is that fair to say?
We received guidance from the investment manager. They don't go on, they look at the numbers over a 5 to 10-year period.
And they're
Yep.
testing
The actuaries look at the numbers over a, 20 to 40-year period. We haven't heard from the actuaries yet.
But you've heard from the investment advisors.
Right.
What, give us the Reader's Digest version of how that's heading, not to be held to, but just so that we're in the loop.
Yeah, I think they think, correct me if I'm about 6.5.
Correct.
That would be the discount raised, the rate of return.
So that's not
So
conservative at all.
they're basically on that 10-year marker or whatever, they're saying 6.5. We're currently at 7.5?
Correct.
Okay, so that would be a point diminution in the wrong direction. Are there things in the other assumptions going in the opposite direction, though?
Right.
Well, that's what we'll hear about in our December meeting.
Okay, so you haven't heard about the other assumptions yet.
Yeah, I wouldn't anticipate any major changes there, though. I mean,
You've revised them as late as last year, I think, on a couple, right?
no, but the last time we did it was, they were all made pretty conservatively, so,
Yep.
Yeah, I don't think it's.
I don't see us going back to anything aggressively. There might be some changes in the future rate of retirement as far as at target date or beyond, but it's not going to change your numbers materially. So the discount rate will probably be the driver, and
I don't know about that.
we're not going to do that all in one time period.
No,
It'll
because we're
be phased in probably over the next 5 years. So
If you're only doing what was required.
But to do that, a point down would be what, about a $3.5 million hit on a $350 million,
Like funding the ARC.
an annual
So it was
$3.5
pay as you
million
go
hit.
As well as paying on. And we just
Something
got
that that's a rough
in the
number.
last couple of years where we were paying the
well,
full
since you're
ARC.
phasing in 0.2 a year, and that gets blended in over 5-year smoothing,
Correct.
I can't even estimate what that's going to do to the budget. I don't think it's going to be a major. That's not going to be one of the things that's going to bother you. It's going to actually be the
Could we get,
performance of the fund
numbers,
in relation
Bob, that
to
you
the
could work
target
out
more
with
than
them
the
regarding
target's going to be.
what's the, that number that you're talking about, Brian? is
So
the least amount
last
of
year's
money that we
sort of
put.
flat
What would that big
return,
number be?
as that gets
You guys
blended in
tell
over
us
the
what
next
that would
5
be?
years,
Gonna hurt
that's
us.
going to make your
Okay. Can you find out actuarially what that would be?
whatever they
If
call
we're
it
over-
anymore. It's not
We're
called
turbocharging this. I
ARC,
want to see
it's
what the
called
difference between turbocharging and what
what's it
our
called?
minimum.
ADEC, ADEC.
But basically, what we can expect is in the next budget cycle, due to all this, we're going to have some upward pressure on our
Well, I
contribution
want
to
the
the
answer,
pension
Mr.
fund.
Right, yeah, the 3 million might be a reasonable number if you did it all at once or something, but
That's what I'm trying to get to, that's over.
then that's on those pieces of paper that are backing me up.
Okay.
Anytime we start adjusting
All right.
what we're doing with any of those accounts.
So that's an upward pressure on expenses. Okay.
Or none.
No, do we want to turn to OPEB?
And we had to do it that way.
That'd be great.
So that,
Great.
I think we need to know what the numbers are.
Any material changes from last
What
quarter
we
on
did
this?
Over the last 5 or 6 years.
No, it's, I think last time we spoke was
Is we
25
started
million. It's
actually funding trust funds.
28.3 now.
Where before, we were just doing the pay.
And returns are slightly above the benchmark. It's a much more simple investment strategy, so.
As well as to start funding the trust.
Okay.
So what we're talking about.
Questions, comments, concerns from anybody on OPEB at this point in time. This is undergoing a similar study at this point as well?
Still pay the pay-as-you-go
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah.
In doing
Same
that,
thing with the discount rate on
we're
this,
worsening
or is the
long-term
discount
financial
rate,
position.
they're
Not
still saying
it's a
6.5 on
discussion
this?
not to have.
Yeah,
I'm
there's
not
no reason to
saying
be different.
information.
What, I thought
clear
our
what we're doing. That would
current
be a
rate is
policy
different, though, is it not? Is it 7.5, or is it 7, or,
We'd agreed to do several
or
years ago.
7.75?
Right. And
I
it's,
don't
by the
know.
way, the state and everybody else.
Can we follow up on that? Because I thought it was,
But a lot of people
it's
aren't,
higher.
which is one of the reasons.
Can we
are
just
where
follow up
we
on
are.
that and see?
Yes, it has something to do with the,
I'm sorry to interrupt. And to
Yeah.
your
I don't think
point
it's
about
higher. I think it's
yeah,
lower.
no.
It's like
Yeah,
5%
it's
off.
got something to do with.
I thought it was low, I thought it was lower
Some
originally.
sort of, because it was assumed with some sort of a cash
they or aren't they? We don't
investment,
know.
Well,
cash
we
plus
think
investment, which actually was invested
Correct.
in a cash type strategy.
Whatever it
until
was,
you
I just thought it was different. So can we just follow up on that
that liability
and see?
could grow
And they're
exponentially.
testing the assumptions on all of this as well, right?
Right.
Much larger unfunded liability.
And the one
Right, because as
kind
you
of
and I
goofy
discussed
assumption
many
in this
times,
whole
I
OPEB
think
thing,
what they're
right?
doing is they're saying that
Well, I'm sure there's
healthcare
others.
costs are gonna grow at
But the one was
5%
that
a year
healthcare
for like
costs
5 years. And then after
grow
5
at
years,
a
they're
nominal
not gonna
amount
grow
for
at all.
several years and then
Look
flatten,
at
Yeah,
what
5.
your
Yep.
calculation of the
right?
long-term
So that's not
liability was.
conservative at all
They
relative to
weren't
healthcare
factoring in
costs.
Growth in medical costs,
Right.
as I recall. Now,
They'll,
that
they'll
might be
tell us
different.
what,
I do remember
what
the
they are, and I guess
5%.
we'll
I don't know what the time
discuss them.
Yeah, they flatlined
This was,
it.
OPEB has been relatively new, so I'd say,
Right.
that- I think it was probably our first experience study 5 years ago, and
Absolutely.
since then, we've changed the investment strategy, and, but I don't think we haven't had an experience study since then.
Be interested to see what the results of that are and what that does to our budget process.
Well,
Yeah, I don't think it's, but because you're paying out of
So we're
pocket
certainly
for the
funding
current
our
expenses, and
pension
you're just turbo funding what this thing is going to be, you're
already.
already, you're putting in a huge chunk of money already above and beyond.
Agreed.
So, I mean, I don't, it's
But
not
what
gonna-
we
it's
u-
not going to require you to put in more. So in other words,
And
you're paying,
Well, I don't know about that.
now out of pocket.
in the internal service fund.
No, because you're
we continue
you're
to be
beyond
behind
anything
on.
that's required. If
But
you were
it'd be
only doing what
interesting
was
to see what
required,
that
you'd be
looks
putting in a
like.
tiny amount.
No,
each
we
year.
weren't beyond what was required, because what we decided was required was similar to like funding the ARC. So it was pay-as-you-go as well as paying on, and we just got up to the level within the last couple of years where we were paying the full ARC.
Right, so you wouldn't be paying, you don't have to do any pay-as-you-go, that's my point. So you're putting in way more money into this.
No, we still do, I thought.
Correct.
Where we break it
You
out
put in
from
more
the
than you
four
have to.
different
But I'm saying
investments
that,
to having
that you're
50
above any
million,
threshold.
100
I think it's a good idea, but
Gonna
it's,
depend on what
it
the,
won't go up anymore.
class managers take. Many of them
Thank you.
have.
Could we get numbers, Bob, that you could work out with them regarding what's that number that you're talking about, Brian, that's the least amount of money that we could put in? What would that number be? Could you guys tell us what that would be?
We have
The actuaries
our
can.
fixed income is
Okay.
being managed.
Can you find out actuarially what that would be? Because if we're turbocharging this, I want to see what the difference between turbocharging and what our minimum would be. We should know that, especially with a difficult budget year coming up.
I disagree with the.
Well, I want the answer, Mr. Chairman.
So as the OPEB total continues to
And-
rise, you'll be starting breaking
that,
this stuff out
actually,
more to the allocation.
Also,
we
just
would
making
see
sure when
similar
it comes
the pension
to,
fund.
like with the ratings agencies, anytime we start
but I
adjusting
expect,
what we're doing with any of those accounts, if
business,
there's any
you know,
potential
unless
impact
returns are
or
phenomenal, I
none,
wouldn't
maybe
expect to
perhaps.
see that for.
Yeah.
Like
No,
what
we
Jim's
should.
thinking if there's no impact, and we had to do it that way, we just make sure that,
I think we need to know what the numbers are. What we did over the last 5 or 6 years, actually further than that, is we started to
All right.
actually fund the trust
gonna
fund.
revert
Where
back to item
before,
number 2,
we
which
were
is
just
the
doing
abbreviated,
pay-as-you-go. And
top
we made a
31
conscious
financial position. Mr. Mayor, I'll
policy
turn it over to
decision
you.
to do the pay-as-you-go piece for the period of time,
We are.
as well as to start
gonna
funding the
be,
trust
driven by
fund.
the,
So what we're talking about is
one-page,
whether we
fiscal year,
dial back what we're
17 quarter one
putting into the
budget
trust fund,
plans,
right?
Correct.
And still pay the
adjustments
pay-as-you-go
that you
piece.
have.
In doing that, right,
This
we're
is a
worsening the long-term
document
financial
schedule
position.
that,
I'm not saying it's a discussion not to have. I'm not
seen
saying that
before,
information,
change.
but let's be clear what we're doing. That would be a policy change from funding the trust fund,
Remember,
as we had
first
agreed to
quarter,
do
we
several
always
years
do an
ago,
overview.
right? And as, oh, by the way, the state and everybody else is not doing, not everybody else, but a lot of people aren't doing, which is one of the reasons we are where we are at the state level right now.
So,
Right.
looking at the.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. And
Yeah.
to your point about if the projections aren't realistic as to the growth of the liability,
Are they or aren't they? We don't know.
and if they, well, and we think that maybe they aren't.
ECS
Correct.
then,
we mentioned earlier.
It's a very good idea that you're putting in as much money as you can now, because that liabilities could grow exponentially if they change those numbers. So you could be talking about a much larger unfunded liability.
Right, because as you and I have discussed many times, I think what they're doing is they're saying that healthcare costs are going to grow at 5% a year for like 5 years. And then after 5 years, they're not going to grow at all. So when you look at what your calculation of the long-term liability was, they weren't factoring in growth in medical costs, as I recall. Now, that might be different.
Yeah, I don't remember. I do remember the 5%. I don't know what the time period was.
Automobiles in our
Yeah, they
grand
flatlined
list
it at
that the
one
state
point,
sent to us that didn't belong
Yeah,
to us.
and I think on my end, I'm more
That's,
bringing up
a
the
maximum
overall
number.
sort
I
of
think
picture when it
it's
comes to
a,
ratings, right? Everything you do,
Absolutely.
even when you're not required to do it, offsets something that you perhaps didn't do. I think in our case, we're probably doing just about every single thing we possibly have to do, and then all the additionals anyways, so it may not be an issue, but
Well-
just looking at the big picture, making sure we have
So we're certainly funding our pension well. We're certainly funding our OPEB, which other municipalities aren't doing. We were way behind on our fund balance, and now we're in very good shape on our fund balance. And
Revenues for this year.
the great unknown that we've had problems with has been the internal service fund, which we continue to be behind on, but it'd be interesting to see what that looks like now that the Board of Education is taken out of that, and there's been some strides made. So it's a very valid point.
That's gonna, looks like you budgeted that a little bit conservatively. So it looks like
Any
there's
other
some
questions?
positive,
Mr. Walsh?
information.
Brian, I think you've answered this before, I just can't remember what the answer was. At what asset level on OPEB do we start managing it with an asset allocation similar to the pension?
So, looking at
Or we break it out from the 4 different investments to having a more broad, was it 50 million or 100 million?
Then
It's going to depend on what the
these,
asset class managers will take. Many of them have certainly like a $5 million minimum, so
The contingency
if we have, call it 10 managers, yeah, that would be $50 million.
We did not need on the expense side.
I mean, we have our fixed income is being managed by the same domestic fixed income manager, for instance. And that's just because they're giving us the benefit of having a sizable amount of money already with
The DOE
them,
number there is the
to the tune of $36 million.
So as the
excess.
OPEB total continues to rise, you'll be starting breaking this stuff out more to the allocation we would see similar to the pension fund?
Yeah, but I wouldn't expect, I mean, that's at least unless returns are phenomenal, I wouldn't expect to see that for a few more years.
A few more years? Okay.
Excess there.
All right.
I don't think there's $230,000.
Anybody else?
Just
Any
still out there.
questions?
I think we'll get some
Thank you,
additional-
Mr. Vane.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Happy Thanksgiving to you and the family.
I think we're gonna get another,
All right.
rebates.
We're going to revert back to item number 2, which is the abbreviated Town Q1 financial position. Mr. Mayor, we'll turn it over to you.
Revenue adjustments. So we are going to be driven by the one-page fiscal year 17 quarter 1 budget variance adjustments sheet that you have. This is a document, a schedule that you've seen before. The numbers have changed. So, as you know, just repeating for those people who may not remember, the first quarter, we always just do an overview as opposed to going through the munis reports because of the lack of meaningful information in this timeline. Time period. So if you're looking at the known or potential revenue shortfalls, the K, the small K there is known, P is unknown, potential. The ECS grant, as we mentioned earlier, from budget to what we think we're going to get now is $1.92 million negative. That was cut from the original budget. And then the other numbers, the MERS, the sales tax, $349,000 less. The potential motor vehicle at risk, if you remember, that's because of the computer problems that the state had, and we received automobiles in our grand list that the state sent to us that didn't belong to us. That's a maximum number. I think it's a think it's high, I think it's conservative, but that's the number that I had in there. And I think if you remember last time we talked about that, I reduced it a little bit, but it's bouncing all over the place. I just put it back up to the max, given the adjustments we took. I mean, it's not the max, but it's, but we, because we did also reserve for $11 million that going away. What we don't have yet with respect to the revenues for this year is the supplemental motor vehicle list. I think that's in our budget at about 70 some odd $million, 71 or 72 million. We have the preliminary numbers. We haven't worked them up yet. Looks like that's going to, looks like we budgeted that a little bit conservatively. So it looks like we'll have some positive information results from that, but that's not on this sheet because we're still working the numbers. So looking at the revenue shortfalls, the total at this time is about $2.7 million. Then compensating adjustments, these, if you remember, are the carryovers from last year. The board voted on. The contingency carryover was $383,000. The contribution surplus we did not need on the expense side because we had the positive revenues that I think brought in, what, about $2 million total? Yeah. And then we have the favorable variance from operations of $207,000. And then the BOE number there is the potential excess Board of Ed medical runout reserve. Looking at the numbers today, we have about $242,000 left to pay the run out, so I think there will be some excess there. I don't think there is $240,000 worth of claims that are still out there, so I think we'll get some additional benefit from that. And then in addition, I think we're going to get another, some more drug rebates that are not in there. So I think there'll be another positive information coming through that line item. Revenue adjustments. The senior tax relief, we budgeted that at a growth rate, but we ended up being the same as the prior year. So we got a $470,000 savings there. Parks and Recs have increased their fees somewhat. They're anticipating $200,000 in excess revenue. And the collection rate, if you remember, the board passed that at 98.63. We ended up last year at 98.68. I think that's reasonable. So we put $125,000 in there. The one item that was in there last time you saw the schedule was investment income potential positive variance, but the interest rates have spiked, as we all know, so we took that out. We're not looking at a negative at this point, but we're not looking at a positive either. That takes us down to expenditure adjustments required for this year to bring the budget into balance. The $40,000 from the assessor and the legal assessment appeals, those we're pretty confident in because they are the, those are based upon the number of Board of Assessment Appeal court cases that we have. So if you add it all up and bring it down to the bottom line, right now, if all this holds out, and like I said earlier, I think there's some other positives that are going to come through. We're looking at a $71,000 positive year-end result.
Before we start asking questions related to GE or anything in the future, let's stick to this schedule and just get that taken care of. Is everybody okay with that? Okay, Mr. Walsh.
Bob, I wanted to ask you, just in comparison to the last time we saw this, some of the things that have changed that you didn't address.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first one is in the known potential revenue shortfalls. Your potential ECS and pilot number, which was supposed to be a negative unfavorable of $1.4 million, has gone to zero. There's nothing listed for it.
Right, and that's I alluded to half of that. I did not address the pilot piece.
Okay.
The background on that, for those who don't recall, when the governor budget was signed, there was the $20 million cut that it was anticipated was going to come from municipal aid, and we did some ratio analysis and some analysis of past budget adjustments by the state and how it might impact us, and thinking, and it would come through the pilot or the ECS grant, and the total, if the state did decrease the budget, the municipal aid portion of the budget by that $20 million, we anticipated that that our share of that $20 million would be $1.4 million. The pilot, we received our full payment, $1,997,000. I think we were budgeted for $2,010,000. And we received $1,997,000, so the shortfall there was only $13,000. And as I mentioned earlier, our first payment for the ECS grant, which was scheduled to be 25%, was just about exactly 25% of the remaining 1.6 that's in the budget. So we took both those out. Thank you for bringing that up. I overlooked that. I apologize.
Okay, and you had addressed a little bit of the motor vehicle. It's doubled now, based on more accurate information?
No, that's my initial number.
Your initial number was 200, now it's a negative 417?
My initial number was 417.
Yeah.
Then we brought it down to 200, and I put it back up to 417. We don't, there's a lot of discussion on that in the office. I don't think it'll be 417, but there's some people that are concerned about that. And the numbers, we're still playing with the numbers. We've had...
Jumping around too much.
Yeah, we've had more. Yeah, I could have left it at 200, but this is for the sake of conservatism, and we've had quite a number of assessment adjustments on the motor vehicle side, and they continue to come in. So there are people in the office that felt better putting that back up to the original calculation, and I said okay.
Okay, and then the last question area that I have is in the expenditure adjustments. So based on those numbers changing to the positive, you're now releasing expenditure adjustments, meaning that you're going to allow the departments to spend in labor, the 50,000, the capital, 700,000, library, 100,000, and fire, 75,000.
Yeah, the administration has not released those funds yet. We're still watching. We'll wait and see what we get with the January ECS payment and see how things fall out.
Okay.
So they could be released towards the end of the year, but as of right now, they're still on hold.
And that's because you don't know whether you are actually going to get all the funds or what.
Right, exactly.
What's going to happen with motor vehicle. So you're
Correct.
holding them really off to the side.
Yeah. I think the early indication on the supplemental motor vehicle is very positive, but there's just still a few unknowns that we'd like to get a better handle on before we actually release the funds.
Why not just keep them on the schedule then to show that they're still being held?
Well, I could do that. It would just increase the 71,000 to $1 million.
Okay. No, I think it would just kind of show us that it's still being held, because when I see it move, I guess,
I understand.
I presume that you've released those funds and the department can spend those funds.
Right, I understand.
So I guess at the next quarterly, if you can give us an update on what's being held, what's not, and I don't know how everybody else feels, but if it's still being held, I'd prefer to see it on the sheet to know that we know that it's still being held.
Yeah, or at least footnoted.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Anybody else? Questions on this schedule?
What are those numbers? 'Cause they're not written down anywhere. I wouldn't mind.
They're on the last. I could pass this thing down, Chris, but at the last quarterly, Bob had made a projection, and
It's at $700,000 for DPW capital equipment. It's $50,000 on legal, and $75,000 on fire, and $100,000, I believe, on library.
Thank you.
What else on this schedule? So, Bob, we don't know any better if we're going to lose any more money from the state this fiscal year.
No, at this point, I'm hopeful that we're not. I don't think we will, but, if we get another payment, but, every time you see news from the state, the revenue collections are below budget, and, so it's trying to be prudent right now.
Okay. Anybody else, questions, comments? What other areas of concern do you have, Bob?
No, we did even though we don't go through the munis formally here at this meeting, we did go through it. And there's nothing that came out, and we also obviously had our discussions with department heads, et cetera, et cetera.
How are
There's-
building permits and conveyances? Is it on budget, above budget?
They're, at this point, they look like they're like within the budget range. The only other thing I'd say is, as we all know, we've had a significant number of open positions, and we put some money in the contingency for differences in salary, and as of right now, we won't need that money.
Can you inform the board, please, about Mr. Ross, just so that everybody's aware?
Don Ross was approached by an executive recruiter who was recruiting for an assessor for, I think, Stony Brook? Brookfield, thank you. And Don's been with the town for 41 years. He's 62 years old. He wants to work for 13 more years. And Brookfield has 7,000 units to assess, and we have 22,000. So he's kind of like downsizing. So he left. His last day was last Friday. So we're looking for a new assessor. We're very close. As just a reminder, we've hired the HR person. The IT person starts December 5th, and we're doing hopefully the last round of interviews tomorrow for the tax collector. And we posted the assessor's position. It got done today, I believe. Monster.com, plus we're putting it in the assessor associations, both Connecticut and surrounding states.
Any questions on that, the open positions, or any of that ongoing? Yes, Mr. Brown?
The new positions, the people that are hired will be on the 401A?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Let's turn now to the latest news that came in as of yesterday, which is the sale of the GE property to Sacred Heart University. The sale, I guess, is to be consummated right now as of December 16th, correct?
I'm not quite sure, given
Okay.
that it wouldn't
Mr.
be
Tetra, why don't you join us, please, at the table? I know we'll have some questions. I know there were some press reports, Mr. Mayor. There was some social media traffic. I had a rather lengthy conversation with you yesterday and a conversation with Mr. Tetra this morning. I asked for you tonight to come and kind of brief the board, update us on the known and the unknowns related to the impact on taxes, timing, and what we can expect moving forward. So I turn it over to you, gentlemen.
Yeah, the
Discussion.
total taxes paid by GE is $1,503,000, I think, for real estate, $291,000 for personal property tax, and $22,599 for sewer tax. The date of the sale really has no impact on our tax collections. The way it works, we have a grand list as of October 1/16. So the values were set at that grand list date. Now, this board sets the mill rate based upon that grand list in May of 17. And that mill rate is for taxes collected in fiscal year 18. So the real estate taxes from GE, the $1,500,000, are secure through June 30th, 2018. The personal property tax, the $291,000, that's self-reported. We do audits, but that is self-reported by the businesses. And those self-reporting schedules are due to the assessor in November. We have not worked through those yet, but given that they moved and they were clearing out, so I imagine there's probably not a lot there. So I think the 291 is probably significantly at risk.
Okay. Then, So that gets us through June of 2018. Does anybody have any questions regarding just that time period? The financial impact for that time period. Mr. Becker?
Just on the personal property, you're saying that's at risk in this fiscal year as well then?
Not this fiscal year, next fiscal year.
Because it's based on the previous October.
Okay,
Increase is greater than
thank you.
Sure. Now let's talk about the 1.5 million going forward from June 2018.
Well, yeah, I mean, that by itself is about, 0.6% on the tax rate, if that's what,
No,
so that's
but
certainly one way to
how
look at
at
it.
risk is, no, I'm asking the question of the 1.5, what's at risk?
Oh, 100%, as I understand it, unless they put dorms there. Now, there's the pilot program.
That's right.
There's two things in the pilot program. Well, there's a couple unknowns from my perspective. One, there is a pilot program where the state reimburses at X percent. The pilot program is operated on a bucket of money, or has been anyway. There's been a bucket of money at the state, and then that state allocates that bucket of money. So the more nonprofit properties in the state, the more towns that receive distributions. So if you build up more nonprofit, if you end up having a greater increase in nonprofit entities in your community, like New Haven, you end up getting more money from the bucket. So it's a relative thing. So that's number one. Number two, I'm not quite sure, given that it wouldn't be the GE business site anymore, that the valuation of the $83 million that produces the 1.5 million would hold. So that number could go down as well. And then the return to us in the pilot program is, I think, just a little more like, it's like 22%, I think, something like that. And there's a lot of people concerned that given the way the state is headed, that the pilot program for quote-unquote richer towns might go away.
Okay, so.
A lot of thoughts
So
there,
there's
I'm sorry.
several things. So there's 1.5 million, of which, best case scenario, what we've been historically averaging is about 22%, right?
Yes, that's my belief, yeah,
So maybe we get $300,000 back from that,
correct.
which means that going forward from June 2018, at risk, just on that is 1.2 million.
Correct.
Okay. Then, what you're saying is the valuation of that property could go down, so that 1.5 could be some number less than 1.5.
Right, and that's where I just don't have the assessor's knowledge to really, but that's something I've been looking at, and I just don't know the answer yet.
Then, you've got the state's fiscal crisis, which means that the 300,000 additional could be at risk.
Correct.
Okay. So what we know is at risk between real estate taxes and personal property taxes is 1.5 million out of 1.8. So really what we're talking about here is a delta of $300,000. Is that?
Correct.
So not this next fiscal year. This next fiscal year we'll have to make up, or our hit is about, could be as much as $290,000, right?
Correct.
Going forward, the hit becomes 1.5 million.
Correct.
Contractual increases.
Now, if you want to talk about hits, I mean, you put them all on the table, right? I mean, there's as you heard from Brian's report, there's going to be discount hit, change in discount rate, plus a catch-up on the loss of, the last year's revenue return was 0.25% rather than 7.5%. So there'll be some, there'll be a hit on the OPEB and the pension budget lines. You may or may not know the MERS sales tax revenue goes away if our budget increase is greater than 2.2% or 2.5%.
2.5, assuming the program is still in place next year.
Assuming the program is still in place.
This year was cut it back.
Right, so I think we get about $700,000.
And that goes away how?
That goes, if our budget is greater than 2.5%.
The other thing that this
There are
number doesn't
some
factor in
exceptions to that.
is the state taking any more away from the
As
town.
with the typical state agreement, any arbitration settlements with union contracts would not count against that 2.5%. Debt service does not count against that 2.5%. There are some other rules of the game with respect to that, not to mention there's plenty of lobbying going on for this to get the state to remove that. But the other issue is that the MERS program, without any of those things, was initially we were due about $1 million in that, and that was reduced by almost $300,000 this year. There's some significant questions, MERS being municipal revenue sharing, whether any of that revenue sharing will actually take place next year as the state scrambles for revenue.
Can we, if we break this down, right, we've got, in the current year budget, right, we've got a revenue shortfall of 2.7 million, right? And there's really no reason to believe that that's, and Mr. Mayor, let's set aside for the fact that you got a conservative number in there of
Mr. Chair, that's not,
400,000.
in the current year budget, we don't have that revenue shortfall because we've made adjustments for it, I believe.
We have that revenue shortfall. You made adjustments so that it's not a shortfall at the bottom line.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, correct, okay, just want to be clear
Yeah.
on the terminology.
Yeah, no, I'm just looking at, thank you. I'm just looking at revenue as we move forward, right? On that list, other than that 400,000 on motor vehicle, Mr. Mayor, I don't see anything there. Everything's there is listed as a known number. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
All right. So let's, to be conservative, let's go with your original number of 200,000 on the motor vehicle, because we know there's ins and outs there. Fair enough?
Mm-hmm.
So then you're at 2.5. We think there's at least 200,000 to 300,000 that's at risk from GE property, correct? Personal property,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's another, let's go 200, say we're going to keep some of it for this year because they're not done moving out, correct?
Yes.
All right. Then the sales tax, this MERS sales tax, how much you've accepted here $350,000 shortfall. After that shortfall, how much is included in the, how much do we have left in that they could,
Yeah, it's on that piece of paper, but I think it's 700,000.
It's about
700,000?
It's about 700,000. We're at a, if you go back to the original budget, I think we had 1.1 that was
Right.
put in on that.
And that's a relatively new, that was a new initiative a couple years
This
old.
year is the first year.
Right. So let's assume, given the budget crisis, that that goes away, right? That's 700,000, right? So now, just year over year, everything else being equal, we're down $3.4 million in revenue. Then, you've got the contractual increases that are union-related. Then, you have the pension and OPEB number, which we don't know what it's going to be. The calculation's not done, but it's going up, right?
Correct.
So we're starting out this next budget cycle at a substantial deficit situation, shortfall.
That is the way we see it, yes.
Which part of Board of Ed?
Well, they have, they're gonna come in with a budget
Yeah.
increase, whatever.
Well,
it
that's,
may
I
be.
was factoring that into just union,
Okay.
but I mean, you're right.
Yes, this has been the topic of discussion, and roughly the way you laid it out is the way we laid it out for the department heads.
Yep.
And helping them explain the constraints we're under in putting together this year's budget. We also, Dr. Tracy and I had a chance to go through that, also with the new superintendent, Dr. Jones.
Okay. I'm going to go to Mrs. Marmion, who had her hand up first. Before I do, though, the other thing that this number doesn't factor in is the state taking any more away from the town in the form of the pilot program or the ECS.
Yeah, and that's a very real concern.
Right, because their
They're at
situation gets worse.
Well, we knew from last year that they had an additional $1 billion to find. If I read the headlines right, and again, I'm reading the same headlines you guys are, so I don't mean
Right.
to suggest any additional insight, but I believe that number is $1.5 billion.
That's what I read. So it's 50% worse than what they thought 3 months ago. Okay. I'm going to go to Mrs. Marmion.
I just wanted to, I was going to say, we also have to factor in the unknown of pilot overall when we have Fairfield U, we're getting payments. We don't know what the shortfall beyond GE is.
Thank you, Mrs. Marmy. Mr. Mayor, on that point, could you just, so that we have a solid number to know, can you give us best available information on what we're going to get from the state this year in revenue? And don't guess of any adjustments downward or anything, just, based on what we know, because it's all at risk. Then I'm going to go to, I think Mr. Hopkins had his hand up, then I'm going to go to Mr. Walsh.
Mr. Mayor, if the transaction with GE closes in December, I think that was the target date. Is that what we're dealing with? What would be the real estate conveyance tax income to the town in that transaction?
Well, it's what, 2%?
No, it's
One-
point,
1%?
it's quarter of, it's quarter of 1%.
0.2%. 0.2%.
No, quarter of 1% is what the town gets. It's 0.0025.
Well, what's 1% of 31 million is?
Oh, I figured it was 70,000 is my rough calculation.
300,000.
Yeah, well, 300 is 1%. A
300,000?
quarter of
Take a quarter
1%
of
is 75,000.
Yeah, I thought it was in the 70s when I
Yeah.
did the calculation.
Yeah.
The only question I have on that is whether there's an exemption on selling it to, and when I haven't looked, I wanted to look at the actual conveyance tax form, because if you look at the conveyance tax form, there's about 22 exemptions for when you don't have to pay a conveyance tax at all. And my question I had in my mind, and I tried to do it today and I didn't have a chance to, is whether there's an exemption on the back of that form for selling a piece of property to a nonprofit.
Yeah, not that I've heard about,
Okay.
but I didn't know there were 22 exemptions
Yeah.
either, Mr. Walsh. So
Yeah.
we'll take a look at that, but
Yeah, it's just a question, because if you...
not that it's come up.
I know.
But that helps us out this year.
It may help us out if there's not an exemption, because you'd be surprised by the number of exemptions there are and what they're for and things like that. So I think that's something we should probably look at before we count that conveyance tax coming in.
Certainly.
Yeah, because to me, it's a
And by the way, it comes in this year
50-50
anyway.
whether we're going to get that.
Right, it doesn't help us next year, it
No.
helps us this year, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
So thank you. Mr. Hopkins, did you have anything
No,
else?
that's it, thank you.
Mr. Walsh?
So, under this, with this tax, it's almost like we get a $700,000 bonus if we keep the budget increase below 2.5%. Because if we do, we lose those funds from the state tax, what we were talking about just about 5 minutes ago.
MERS?
Well,
The MERS.
two things.
Okay.
You're talking about the MERS program.
Yes.
If it's still available and if it's that high.
Well, I would hope it would still be available, because we have state legislators who talk this state and its state legislature into a tax increase, a sales tax increase, and they sold that on giving the municipalities some of that money. It's the only reason that passed. But now they're trying to take it away. It's kind of like one of those things, it's like, once somebody gets their hand into your pocket, you got to question, oh yeah, I'll give you some of that back. So I would hope that some of that would stay there, but I guess you have to plan for the worst.
Yeah, my caution is that talking about what Hartford may do
Yeah.
when they don't know what they're going to do yet is certainly a challenge.
Sure.
They identified the program. We were budgeted, targeted at 1.1 million. They cut it by roughly a third,
Yeah.
down to 700,000.
Hmm?
I could easily see that getting cut, if not eliminated.
Mhm.
And they won't be eliminating the MERS program, because they're using that to fund the difference in the mill rates on car taxes.
Mhm.
The question is not whether they have the MERS program. The question is whether any is allocated to the portion of the program we're getting.
Okay.
So to your point, they will definitely keep, I think, part of that in to fund the difference in the mill rates
Mhm.
for auto taxes for the cities and some of the high mill rate places. I'm not sure there'll be any left down at this level. And I have again, I don't have any inside knowledge on that. I'm just looking at the revenue trends and everything else and saying, Hartford needs more money, they have to get it from somewhere.
And this is a new program.
So yes, and while it's 700 grand for us, since most towns are smaller than us,
Mhm.
It's a smaller number for most other towns.
Mhm.
So there may not be as many people arguing as strongly for it.
I think we're going to have to take a hard look, though, as we get closer and see what the discussions are in that area, because, I mean, 700,000, 700,000. And with some of the losses we discussed already tonight, I'm going to be hard-pressed to go over that 2.5% increase to lose another $700,000. I mean, it's just, we're going to have to take a look at it and I guess talk to our state reps about where those discussions are. And I hope everyone's honest about those conversations, because it's going to really affect us if we make a decision one way or another. I mean, I want that 700. I know you do as well. But in order to get that, I think we all got to keep focused that this budget's going to have to be below 2.5%.
And there'll be a lot of discussion along those lines. CCM is lobbying strongly to either remove or push back the 2.5% cap until it can be better defined. There's also a question of what exactly is included in that. And I'm just not fluent in everything that's included. I know it's written out somewhere, and we certainly will have that. The challenge is timing in all things. We're going to make our decisions in March.
Yeah.
The Assembly will making their decisions later in the year. We have, CCM has requested they make the municipal aid decisions earlier in the process. With a change in leadership and other things going on, I don't think they've had a response on that yet.
Okay. And I was going to ask you, just to follow up on that, have you heard anything further about that? Because I know CCM was pushing for that, because it was a very unfair process where we're setting budgets and other municipalities are setting budgets, but then Hartford's coming up with decisions later. And I know CCM was pushing that maybe they should make these decisions in regards to municipal reimbursement at least earlier.
Yeah, there's several different CCM initiatives going on right now. One is a revenue diversification subcommittee that I'm on as part of that. The second thing is looking at different ways towns can be authorized to raise money. The second is we just had our CCM conference where we got together with our legislative committee and identified those things we're going to be pushing as part of the new legislative session coming up, and that was one of them.
Okay. Thank you.
One of the other things the board should note, I have reached out to at least one member of our state delegation, and I'm going to talk to others about whether they would be willing to come in to kind of brief our board as to what they see is going on at Hartford, so that we can make at least the best informed decision we can. The problem with that is that they said, we don't have any information right now, and we're not going to have any better information in January, February, because that's when they're really just going to get started. So they were saying, anything that they told us would be as permanent as what we already have, right? And it goes back to the point, Jim, and to CCM's comment regarding the fact that they don't decide what they're going to do with municipal aid in enough time for us to make an informed decision, right? So it's always been based on best practice, or past practice, rather, and that's what bit us last year. So, just so you know. Mr. Becker.
And just to say, I mean, it's actually going to be, right, this year's their longer session, so the timing's going to be even further past when we even make those decisions.
Correct.
Right?
That's exactly right.
So to some degree, making sure we understand, like I know you put as a follow-up to understand exactly what we're at this point even getting from a state perspective, because you talk about and you look at the Board of Ed and the open choice decisions and other decisions that have been made on the town and the Board of Ed side. At some point, this fund we keep making decisions based upon, well, they're going to take money away if you don't do all these things, and the pot's going further and further and further, and I wouldn't be surprised in 2 years if the pot is down to almost nothing. Yet all the decisions we're making so they don't take the pot away probably cumulatively hit at least what we're getting, if not more, in the on the penalty side. It's something to start.
It's a very turbulent environment up there, and if they're not hitting their revenue targets, they're going to continue to make adjustments. And if you remember back to last spring, I'm going to say in a May timeframe, there were certain programs where folks were told, up until May, we've been telling you you're going to get this money, and we're telling you now. Fairfield was not involved in those programs, so we did not get hit, but certain towns and municipalities got told in May they wouldn't be getting a check by June 30th as they were promised. So it's a very turbulent environment up there, and I think we have to look very carefully at what money we are planning on to get from the state.
Yeah. Mrs. Marmon, you had a follow-up question.
I just have a question. If Well, once Sacred Heart University takes over the GE property, and if they put a for-profit business on that property, somebody, I think I read something about a Starbucks, or I know there's a hotel that they're going to run as part of their hospitality program, but if there were for-profit businesses on the campus, those would all be part of our grand list, and they'd be paying taxes. Is that correct, if it's owned by a nonprofit, if the property overall is nonprofit?
Yes, yeah, for-profit activities by nonprofits are taxable, and my information is probably no better than anybody else's information, but what I've heard is they're putting swimming pools in a hockey rink.
Say that one second.
But that's for their
Swimming
students, or
pools
is
and a
that for,
hockey rink?
is
Yeah,
that
their-
a for-profit for the community, or is?
For just like a gymnasium, for whether they let other people use it or not, I have no idea, but.
Okay.
I think Sacred Heart is still putting together the details on everything they're going to put in, but we do have precedent and cases that have come up in recent years where a for-profit business was being run on a not-for-profit parcel of land, and we just started taxing them. They took us to court, and we won.
But the issue becomes, right, whether it's, to your point, if they sublease to a Starbucks, that's obviously a for-profit.
Yeah, the definition is it part of their mission.
Right.
So if it's not part of the education mission,
Exactly.
So it's not part of the, if you will, the not-for-profit mission, then it eminently becomes taxable.
Right.
But if you're running a hospitality division, and that's part of your mission, that you are going to be running a hospitality, school, and you're going to have actually a practice on there to have people run through it, the question becomes, I guess, if they're making money doing it, but it's part of their mission,
Right.
it all depends, I guess. You're going to have to see what.
Definition, and certainly, as you know, lawyers can parse this out in several different ways, but simply put, if they bring Hilton Hotels in to run a hotel, that's not necessarily part of their mission. If they are running as part of their hospitality department.
Exactly.
And the everything else is run by Sacred Heart.
Yeah.
Then you argue that's a educational component.
Yes.
Much like Great River Golf Course.
Yes.
Right. And that's not in Fairfield, so we're all objective on this. If they bring that in and run that as part of their recreational program, then they can run it, and they can bring folks in from the outside, and they can use that as an educational opportunity. They form a separate corporation, or if the Great River Inc. is running that.
Yes.
And barely hiring some students.
Yeah.
Different story.
Different story.
So.
It's all fact-based.
Some of that will have to play out.
Yes.
But certainly, we will look at that very carefully.
Yes.
And of course, they're going to think of that as they go about putting their business plan, because that tax hits enough of a hit in many different ways, not just real estate taxes.
Well, that,
they're
unless
gonna
they
figure
just
it.
do what every other landlord does and just pass it on to the tenant.
Right.
Right? You just
If it's going to be a third party like a Starbucks, but
You
if
do
it's
a
going to be
triple
their
net lease
hotel,
and-
they're not going to do that.
Yeah.
In reading the article on this by Ms. Riley, who's in the room, it said the sale price was $31.5 million. Do you have any information to believe that the actual sale price was higher, but that GE gave a donation to get a tax deduction? Kind of similar to the way Sacred Heart did this exact same thing with that golf course you're talking about, where they, I think, my numbers may be wrong, but I know this was part of that plan, where they paid it's either the total price was $9 million, but they only had to pay $6 million, or it was they paid $9 million, but there was like a $3 million component that was considered to be a charitable deduction. Because it would seem to me that if that's the case, it's going to help our assessment information, assessment case, that the actual number was higher. So part of the price could have been a charitable contribution. And that doesn't have to be, it could just be like, we know we're underselling it, because we're going to claim a tax deduction, because what we're going to do as GE is we're going to get a professional assessment of this property to show the IRS that it's worth, let's just take round numbers, $60 million. But we're going to sell it to you for 31.5, and we're going to take a deduction. They have many tax attorneys, as your administration's probably worked with. So the reason I'm saying that is because that's exactly what Sacred Heart did in purchasing the golf course. So I would ask that the administration try to get to the bottom of that somehow, or at
Was it
least try to
Sacred
figure.
Heart that did it, or was it actually the?
No, Sacred Heart, it's the seller, Great
River
River,
did it.
Great,
Because they're the
I
one.
think
who
it was the
did
Lenosi
production.
family who owns it, and they owned Great River, but there was a charitable contribution portion of that.
Right.
Where they got a tax deduction for the amount from their assessed value, appraised value, excuse me, and the amount that they gave them to, sold them the property to.
The simple answer is certainly we'll look at that.
Yes.
The practical side is, no, I don't have any information
Okay.
that that was taking place. Every conversation with GE I had, they were very adamant that they were selling the property. Now, technically, they sold it, how they structured the deal,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, that's
I
gonna
don't
be
have
all
any
fine.
information on
That-
it. But
that's all.
it's all private information any more than we can't go to Great River and get that information in.
I don't know whether it's private information because you're taking a very public IRS tax deduction on it. So I don't think it's actually private.
We've had an issue recently with tax returns not being shown. And even though some
How'd that work out?
significant deductions,
Mhm.
actually, I didn't have any of the money involved, Chris, but, so I'm not sure that information is public, was my point.
Mary?
Well, wouldn't, for conveyance tax purposes, it be based on the value of the property if they were going to take a charitable deduction?
Could be.
Well, I would
Yes.
defer to our local real estate attorney.
Yeah, it could be, but we're talking about numbers now.
Well,
I mean,
also, GE's a public.
we might have to look at that. So,
GE's a public company.
If there's any thoughts as to where we can get that information, either in this room or anybody watching on TV, I'd be more than interested in hearing.
yeah. I mean, at some point, we might want to just ask them, is there any part of that that's, they want to lie to us, they can lie to us, but it might come out anyway. But it would just seem to be, number one, the fact that Sacred Heart did that with their last large property purchase. So I'm sure in trying to sell a price or whatever, they might have posed that because that has a certain value, because a company like GE, you can use that tax deduction for that charitable contribution.
I think the other thing to keep in mind on this, it's very important, is that when you're coming up with what's called the fair market value for a property during an appraisal, it's based on an arm's length transaction in a normal market. While this was an arm's length transaction, it was not a normal market. This would be more classified as a distressed sale. Part of GE's criteria were no contingencies and a very short time period. Think about the process that this took place in literally months, from initial discussions to closing. So I'm not sure that qualifies as a arm's length transaction in a normal market. I'm not an appraiser. The appraiser will have to evaluate that, but certainly that would increase the value that they would appraise the property at.
And this hits us in two ways. Number one, conveyance. Number two, and more importantly, the value of that property as we move forward as it relates to the pilot program and stuff like that.
Correct.
And that's also going to be impacted by whatever Sacred Heart does with that property anyway, right? Because if they invest in that property, I would imagine if the pilot program still exists, right,
Well,
that we're going to get the benefit of them investing, the tax would be higher, so we would get a higher percentage on that.
yeah, I mean, the other place we will get significant funds in this is from building permits.
Mhm.
That
Exactly.
property
Yep.
needs a tremendous amount of work. There's some people that suggested that the best thing you could do is knock it down and start over.
Yep.
That in terms of the functional use, permanent real estate is functionally obsolete. What that was designed to do isn't what any of the applications you're going to put in there do.
Yes.
And having been through the building, there's certainly enough deferred maintenance.
Yeah.
You certainly have space laid out, not in a manner to parcel up at all. So there'd be some significant work that
I think it'd be
would
significant.
impact building permits, that type of.
For years to come.
Which is great, but it's not renewable, or it's not
It just buys us time.
ongoing.
Correct.
It just buys us time. It's
Part
one-time shots.
of the income bridge,
Right. Right. It's just a one-time shot.
well, in
It's not a
550,000
recurring
square
revenue
feet, it'll
stream.
be a multiple
Well, I think
one-time
it'll be-
shot. But
I think
you're
It's
right.
not recurring. It happens,
It's-
it's over,
Yep.
they do another one, it happens again, it's over, they do another one.
Yeah, it's
not
probably
1.9 a
going to
year.
take them a few years to do all that, so, for the short term, not for
Yeah.
long term, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
But it's more than a one-year hit in that sense.
I would agree with that. And quite frankly, we don't know how many years that might take. They're going to buy it, and then they're going to have to do all
the analysis, what they're going to do with it, design it, so you might not get anything for a couple of years, and then for a few years you'll get a bunch, and then not get anything again, or get smaller, right?
Right. And just to state it absolutely clearly, nonprofit or for-profit, you still owe us the building permit fees.
Right. Thank you.
There's also other silver linings. I mean, as things expand there'll be more people coming into town who are spending more money in this town with our merchants, who will hopefully buy houses in the town to keep the real estate market churning and possibly going up and things like that. I mean, it's hard to replace $1.8 million. But, and I'm not saying that that's going to do it, but there are some silver linings if we're in a situation we really can't control any further.
I think your point's well taken. I think in the long run, this could be very positive for the
Yes.
town of Fairfield and our economic growth.
Mhm.
The real issue is in the short run, in
Yes.
terms of what the impact is there,
Mhm.
and how we get that bridge to the long run.
Yeah.
Could be. Mary?
Do you anticipate the town's expenses increasing for police, fire coverage for that property? GE had a very quiet presence, and Sacred Heart will have a much larger presence.
Okay, well, GE may have a quiet presence from a public standpoint, but there was a lot of work going on from security and that type of thing behind the scenes. You remember there's a police car parked up there that they bought to park up there, but we were coordinating security with police and fire with them on a regular basis, and there were, I don't want to use the word incidents too strongly, but there were some things that took place up there that we got involved with. From a standpoint of the university, since I don't believe they're putting dorms there, it's more classrooms and learning spaces, that type of thing. I don't see that as having a dramatic, big difference in terms of police and fire, but that is part of our evaluation that we'll go through with that. And I should point out at this time that I'm going to be sitting down with the president of Sacred Heart next week and starting a series of discussions about how we can creatively work with them to mitigate some of the tax loss here.
Well, it'd be nice if he represented to you properly whether there was a charitable contribution portion of this thing and what the deal was. It would be a nice, honest footing to get off on.
All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
And I just want to point out again the sewer use. I know we've talked about it with the Fairfield U as being one of the biggest users of our sewer system, and we've had past discussions about this. And I know it's not dormitories that they're looking at, but a hotel. Again, it goes to the larger question of how we ask the nonprofits to pay for some of the sewer usage.
The sewer use they pay, much like Fairfield U does now, and more like the state does now, in fact, in their properties. So Fairfield U is one of our largest WPCA clients and one of our largest source of fees for that. GE was one of our larger, I think, Bob, you mentioned almost $30,000 a year in sewer use fees. I would expect that to go up with any sort of revamped usage on this.
Yeah, the other issue, though, is who pays for the treatment plants.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
We'll have to wait and see.
where they play, that's a whole nother issue
GE
that
won't.
Sheila's bringing up.
Any other questions, comments,
That what you brought up?
concerns?
I'm sorry,
Well, it's a combination. When you pay for sewers, you pay for the plant, the building of the plant
Yeah.
through bonds,
All we're talking
and you
about
pay
is-
for sewer tax.
right,
No,
all
we're
we're
just
talking
talking
about
about
is the
the
sewer
sewer.
use fee that they
Correct.
get billed every quarter and pay.
Right. That's it.
I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you. Seeing any,
Guess there'll be less helicopter noise complaints.
there you go. All right.
Only if they disable the helipad.
Thank you,
True.
Mr. Tetra.
True.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Next thing, very briefly, any updates from any of our Board of Finance subcommittees? Mrs. Leclerc, anything from the Audit Committee at this point?
Nothing to report. I haven't heard anything.
Okay, Mr. DeWitt, on the committee that's looking at building committees.
We had our kickoff meeting this evening, actually, and I'll be reaching out to some of the town entities for some backup paperwork. I'll also be reaching out to Mr. Tetra for a little bit of information and history on some building committees.
Okay.
And then can we go, Mr. Walsh, anything, we were going to talk about the, and you asked for some time, so.
Yeah, we're going to just, I'm trying to schedule, I'm going to put an initial
Fund
meeting
balance.
together, but I'm trying to get a meeting scheduled with Mr. Centofanti and Mr. Spurndale, which we're going to have the chief fiscal officer there as well, just to see what the marketplace is currently for where other municipalities are and whether there's any beneficial change in positions that they know of from working with the other municipalities they work in on what the targets are.
Great.
And I think it'll be a good place for us to start getting that official information.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Is there any other business that anybody else has? Mr. Mayor?
Follow up to an earlier conversation with respect to OPEB.
Yes.
The Board of Ed portion of the OPEB liability
Yep.
is funded through an implicit rate subsidy, so that portion of the OPEB liability has a discount rate of 4.5%.
Okay.
The non-implicit rate subsidy, the town side, is at the same 7.5%.
Okay. Thank you. Mrs. Leclerc?
Oh, I just wanted to ask Mr. Mayor if he could follow up on the progress of the audit and if they're on time to deliver the reports in December or the draft of the reports.
Everything is going well. As of Friday, there's 0 general ledger adjustments. And there was some delay in getting some information from the Board of Ed, but I don't think that slowed us down.
Great, thank you.
All right. Lastly, there was some communication just given to me tonight in a letter dated November 16th. I'll just read it into the record so that we have it. It'll be part of the budget process from Mr. Tetro. It comes from the Connecticut Challenge. And it basically thanks us for continued praise of the Connecticut Challenge, and every year the town of Fairfield recognizes non-for-profits through the Neighborhood Assistance Act, and for that they're grateful. They're writing to ask that we continue our generous support of the Connecticut Challenge by including it in the yearly operating budget under the not-for-profit agency section of the budget. If you have the resources to allocate $25,000 of additional funds towards our mission. It's directed to me for the Board of Finance consideration. Just to publicly note, it is not the Board of Finance that decides whether it gets included in the not-for-profits section of the annual budget, but I pass that along so that everybody awares that they're asking for some direct contribution from the town, and I assume that the administration received the same letter. I'll leave that to your gentlemen's best judgment as to what to do with that in terms of the budget process. I know they do good work, and they do have our praise, and we thank them as well as all the other not-for-profit organizations that do good work for our community. Does anybody have anything else? Seeing none, I'd like to wish everybody and your families a happy Thanksgiving, a happy and healthy holiday, and we'll see you just after for our next scheduled meeting. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Mottola, do I have a second? Mr. Walsh, all in favor?
Aye.
Abstentions? We're done. Thanks, everybody.